Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Venerable elders in the Sangha and lay community, I have been asked today to speak on Ajahn Chah's use of the Vinaya, the monastic discipline, as a way of training. Paul Samedo this morning was talking a bit about Achaan Chah's way of using the Vinaya, and I remember last night I was speaking to him in his room, and he was saying that even though the Vinaya can seem very complicated, lots of rules, when you looked at Ajahn Chah, it just looked like he was exhibiting freedom. You know, he didn't look like someone who was bound by rules. He just got this feeling when he met Ajahn Chah that there was just freedom there. It's a bit like when I was in a former life. You know, I used to play music, and to be a musician you have to spend hours and hours and hours just doing basic exercises. And it can be very tedious and sometimes boring. It takes a lot of discipline. But once you've mastered that, then you are able to arrive at a state where it becomes more effortless. You don't have to think about it. It just becomes a natural way of life. And when the Buddha talked about what he was teaching, he didn't call it Buddhism. He didn't call it Gautama Wada. He could have called it Siddhartha Yana, but he called it Dhamma Vinaya. And he didn't just say, after I die, then the Dhamma will be your teacher. That would have made sense. The Dhamma is nature, the laws of life, the laws of nature, the laws of living in harmony with nature, the laws of truth that allow us to awaken, to live in harmony with the laws of nature. This is really what's liberating. This is what's special about the Dhamma. This is what is attractive about the Dhamma, this idea of liberation, freedom, a reduction of suffering, increase of happiness. But when he talked about his dispensation, his collection of teachings, he said, this is the Dhamma in the Vinaya, as if it's one phrase, one inseparable combination. Because the Buddha was, in addition to being completely liberated, extremely practical. He understood people. He understood what it meant to live in a community. He understood ultimate reality, but he also understood conventional reality. And he was able to use his practical wisdom to create conventions which then would assist unenlightened people towards ultimate reality. And that, I think, is just as impressive as having realized the ultimate truth. The fact that he was able to use his practical wisdom to create a lifestyle which would outlast him, which would outlast his generation, which would last. Amazing. Can you imagine trying to create something today that's going to still be around 2,552 years from now? So when we talk about Dhamma and Vinaya, we're talking about a lifestyle which is so intertwined that a lot of the ways that the Forest Masters would teach would kind of go in between and flow seamlessly between high Dhamma and very ordinary, mundane things. Achaan Chah and his generation, they could be talking about anatta, or emptiness, 1 minute, and then flow seamlessly to, who didn't wash the spittoons? And there wasn't really a sense that there was a big difference between the two. Because if you're really taking responsibility for the Dhamma, then you're taking responsibility for developing mindfulness moment by moment. You take responsibility for washing the spittoons so other people don't have to. In Thailand, we used to make a lot of our own requisites out of white cloth, and then we'd have to sew it together. And mostly in those days, we didn't have electricity, and so we just had one of these treadle machines. And how the top thread and the bobbin thread would work together. It was very much the way that Dhamma and Vinaya work together. They intertwine that way. They're different, and yet when you make an effort, when you sew, then they come together, and then you can actually create things. You create something useful and beautiful. In the beginning, it's not beautiful, but it's useful. Just the other day, yesterday, was the Opposita. And one of the conventions of our tradition is that we come together. For those monastics who are fully ordained, we come together and chant the Patimokkha, which is the recitation of the 227 rules of the bhikkhu's training. And rituals such as this is a way of honoring the importance of Vinaya in our training, bringing it up. Even something as simple as that is a ritual which can tie us together. I mean, here we had monastics coming together from all different corners of the world. We had people coming from Europe, from Asia, from New Zealand, from all over the world. And okay, it's time to do the Patimokkha. Boom, we're all there. We're able to share in that communal harmony. And just knowing that for generations and generations and generations, that has been happening, this upholding of the Vinaya. It's very inspiring. It's like it ties us, seamlessly in a tradition, in a lineage, right back to the Buddha. And it also ties us to the rest of the people in the world who are doing the same thing. And even in such small rituals, a lot comes out. The recitation of the Vinaya is held in such high regard that someone who is going to do the chanting, they get the high seat. Luang Por was there, obviously the most senior one. But who gets the highest seat is the one who's chanting. But there's also a great sense of deference to seniority. So the one who's chanting then bows and asks for permission. Please, I ask for permission to recite the Vinaya. And then they're given permission to get on the high seat. And then when you go through the Vinaya, there are rules which are based on morality. There are rules which are based on restraining desire. There are rules which are based on laying a foundation for meditation. If you're sitting in meditation, it doesn't take too long before some of the moral mistakes we might have made in life start to come to the surface in the form of memories. One of the hindrances that people regularly encounter in meditation is a sense of remorse for the things that geez, shouldn't have done that, or maybe I shouldn't have said that, or something I did or said in the past led to someone else feeling pain. And when that comes up in meditation, it's a natural karmic effect, which is different than guilt. But it's a hindrance to peace of mind nonetheless. So keeping a very pure standard, to the best of our ability, of monastic discipline, or an ethical standard, of which we call sila, then that naturally creates a very strong foundation for meditation. And then we have rules which assist communal harmony, which leads to peace within the harmony. We have rules which also just are based on the Sangha itself being an inspiring example in society. Because especially in the world today, we're sometimes short of inspiring examples in society, in the mainstream society. So it's good to have a certain very clear boundaries. Because once we ordain, whether we like it or not, whether we realize it or not, we become a representative of the Buddhadharma, wearing these robes out in public. We're not invisible. Sometimes people notice us. And our behavior, our demeanor, our attitude, these all then reflect on the entire Sangha. So there's a deep responsibility. Okay, once we've taken on these robes, then there are certain rules which then encourage a certain proper, circumspect states of mind. When Ajahn Chah was first studying the Vinaya, initially he was living in a city monastery, a village monastery in those days, which didn't keep very strict Vinaya. And when he started to come across the monastic rules, he realized, wait a minute, there's a bit of discrepancy here between the way the monastic Sangha is living in this monastery and what is supposed to be done according to the text. And so he started to feel a bit of something wasn't quite right there. And then he decided that, he was actually going to make that step to try to practice the Vinaya 100%. And when he really got into it, really started studying, then he would study sometimes for hours and hours and hours. And that's an important phase in understanding the Vinaya. It's like doing scales when you're a musician. Mastering the details. And at Ajahn Chah's monastery, sometimes they would just read out some of these Thai commentaries, for hours at a time. There's this Thai commentary called the Pubasika Wanana, in which some of the early Western monks had to sit there listening to this being read out in a language that they barely understood for hours at a time, over and over and over again. So I was saying this morning, if they want me to give a talk on how Ajahn Chah actually taught the Vinaya, maybe I'll just read out the Pubasika and give them a real flavor. I'm just sitting there for hours, patiently enduring. But then after Ajahn Chah had studied the Pubasika Wanana, after he'd studied the Patimokkha, the monastic discipline, after he'd studied the Visuddhimagga, these great commentarial works, it all just seemed to start to get so complicated. And by that time, he was getting more involved with other forest monks And so he went to the great forest master Ajahn Mun and asked Ajahn Mun about this predicament. Here I am. I really want to practice the Vinaya, 100%, and yet, looking at all these details, it seems impossible that anyone can do that. And then Ajahn Mun said, well, that's true, but just focus on certain aspects of it, which are the essence. Try to learn how to distill the essence while still following the details. And the essence that Ajahn Mun encouraged at that time was what was called hiri and ottappa. Hiri was this sense of conscience, having a sense of conscience or shame, and ottappa is a fear of wrongdoing. So if you have these two, then that's going to be an internal compass. It's going to be a guide. Make sure we don't go off track. Hiri it's compared to like if you have a metal bar and one half of the metal bar is smeared with excrement and the other half of the metal bar is red hot. And so the half of the metal bar is like a sense of shame and, things that we may have done in the past. We just don't, we're not proud of that. It's not clean. You don't really want to stick a hand in it. And then the types of actions that we can understand as being bad karma, we can see the connection between happiness, unhappiness, and our actions and our intentions. And so we don't even want to touch that because we know it's red hot. And so this forms like an internal guide that helps to distill the essence. So once you've mastered all of these details, then you kind of distill the essence. And then Ajahn Chah said from that point on, it starts to become more and more of a mind training. Less and less of just following rules, but more and more a mental training, because the whole lifestyle becomes so natural. In the beginning, it seems like, so many rules, do this, do this. You've got the Vinaya rules, and you've got monastic discipline, and you've got the protocols for the particular monasteries. There's so much to think about from the morning when you get up until going to bed at night. There's always something to do, and the proper way to do it, and the wrong way to do it, and now everyone's telling you which is which. It can seem kind of complicated, but once that becomes more internalized, then it actually leads to a great sense of simplicity, where you don't have to endlessly try to decide how things are going to be done externally. You don't have to, get together and have a discussion every day about how we're going to do things, because you just, this is the way it's done. This is the agreed way. And even if people are coming from different corners of the world, if there's a shared monastic etiquette, then, boom, everyone knows this is the way you do things. You don't have to spend time in endless discussion. It actually simplifies things. So there are many rules which have to do with reduction of desire. Things which may not be necessarily evil per se, but help to restrain the heart from flowing out. Wanting this, not wanting that. There's lots of rules about food, for example, how to relate to food, proper ways of relating to food. There was one time that Ajahn Chah was he needed to go to central Thailand, to Sarapuri, on some business. And he went with a group of his disciples. And he stayed at a monastery there that didn't keep the Vinaya all that strictly. And in the morning, Ajahn Chah and his disciples and the other monks would all go out on alms round, and then when they would come back, whatever food was gathered was then sit down, and the lay people set it out. And then the monks just took the food without it being offered properly, arranged it, and then they had a very simple, perfunctory way of offering it, which wasn't really in accordance with the Vinaya. And in those days, Ajahn Chah was very strict. And so all the food that they got on that alms round, they wouldn't touch it, because after it had been improperly handled by the Sangha there, then it was passed down the line. But really all Ajahn Chah and his monks had was the rice, plain rice that they had gotten on alms round. And all the other food they would just let go by. And they didn't say anything. They didn't complain. They just ate plain rice. And as far as we know, they were content with it. But after being there for a few days, then the local monks started to say, what's the deal? You're not eating any of our food. And Ajahn Chah, being very sensitive, then said, well, I better go talk to the abbot. And so he went and spoke to the abbot and very politely explained the situation. Said, well, look, we have this standard that we follow, and according to our understanding, then we're not allowed to eat this food without it being properly offered. And he wasn't trying to change their way of doing it, but he just wanted to put them at ease, to let them know where he and his monks were coming from. And once that was explained, then the abbot of that monastery said, sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. That's great. He's never before had he seen monks who were so meticulous about keeping the minor rules. And he said, that's wonderful. He said, that's fantastic. And he supported it. And so from that time on, they changed the way they were doing things. And so eating food that is not offered just one particular way, there's nothing particularly morally evil in it. But there are rules which can help to restrain our desire. When I was a young monk at Wat Bananachat, this branch monastery for non-Thai speaking monks that was begun by Ajahn Sumedho. In those days, in the afternoon, if you wanted to have a drink of tea or whatever, your only opportunity was to come at a particular time at the abbot's kuti, and there would be some big kettles, and they would get passed around twice. And that was it. You couldn't really make your own whatever was there in the kettles. That was it. And occasionally the kettles were brought in, and they were sitting in there, and some young monk, maybe a bit over-enthusiastic, would go over and touch it and pick it up and start to pass it out before it was actually offered by the novices. And then according to Ajahn Chah's standard, that kettle, all that tea had to be sent right back to the kitchen. No one could have it. Or sometimes they would relax the standard a bit and say, well, only that monk can't have it. Depending on how much they wanted the tea. But these are rules which are designed to reflect our own desire and bring us back to being mindful all the time. So there was nothing particularly morally apprehensible about going and touching and picking up a kettle of tea which was not properly offered. But it reflected back that that particular monk wasn't being completely mindful. And so the Vinaya works in this way, to be a reflection on our states of mind. It becomes more and more a mental training. Ajahn Chah would encourage his disciples to follow many of the Dhutanga practices. Dhutanga practices are austere practices that were encouraged or allowed by the Buddha. And so many of the forest masters would encourage their disciples to take on some of these practices. For example, just eating everything out of one bowl. Right? Now, you wouldn't have to do that according to the Vinaya, but this just adds one more notch of difficulty, which can put a little more pressure on our desire, a little more restraint is necessary. Because if you have a lot of good food, and then you have to throw it all in one bowl, it kind of gets a bit messy. Right? You get used to it after a while, but in the beginning, a lot of people find it a bit disgusting. Whatever you might you might have a nice dessert here, and then you might have spaghetti sauce here, then you might have peanut butter here, and they're individually all great, but once you mix them together, it's not great. Right? And then you throw a scoop of ice cream on top, and forget it. Just forget it. This is tough practice. And Ajahn Chah would generally encourage eating one meal a day. That was basically the standard, just one meal a day. And eating, before noon. This was the standard in the Vinaya. Now, there's nothing evil. There's nothing morally wrong with eating food in the afternoon. But again, these rules just help to confine our desires within certain ranges, and they help to simplify life. Just keep the whole process around the meal just confined to a certain time of the day, and then refining it even more, just to have one meal a day. It's enough. If we're eating just as a medicine to keep the body going so we can practice the Dhamma, then it's enough, it's good enough. These days, if you go on wandering practice called Tudong, in the West, it really is a good practice because you're going out there with your bowl and you don't know what you're going to get. We do this in New Zealand regularly as part of our annual schedule. For a month every year we go wandering around the country. And if it's just monks themselves, without any lay attendants, then you can't carry food. You don't have any money. You're traveling around, and even if someone does offer you food one day, you can't store it the next day. So each day, you don't know where your next meal is coming from. It's a very good practice. And when you are offered food, into the bowl, a great sense of gratitude starts to arise. Even for something very simple. Someone just gives you something very simple. A sense of gratitude arises. And that also, again, is bound up with how we use the Vinaya, because when we go on alms rounds, there are rules about behavior on alms round. We don't go out and ask. We're not allowed to ask people for food. We can stand silently. Someone understands what we're doing, then they can come and offer. If they come and ask, then we can explain. But we don't ask. We don't beg. And these days, the wandering practice is extended to international flights. This is the modern forest monk. And so that adds a whole nother aspect to it, because when you're on international flights, say, well, I can eat up till noon, but what time is it actually when you're flying through different time zones? Say, well, you can try to be really tricky and say, well, okay, they're serving lunch now. Well, let's see. In the country that I left from, it's still before noon. Should I take that as a standard? Or in the country that I'm going to, it's still before noon. But quite often, you just have to go back to the basic Vinaya standard, which is wherever we are, we take that time. And so quite often on international flights, you may have to go a long period of time. Maybe you're flying in the afternoon and the evening for a long period of time. This would tend to happen a lot. When I'd go from Thailand back to the United States, it was a long period of time, almost 36 hours before I could actually eat again. And it would be easy enough to justify saying, oh, well, let's just be reasonable. But part of what is, I think, a good training about the Vinaya is that it forces us to say, okay, well, this is the boundary. And then once I come up against this boundary, what's my mental reaction? And that's really where the training comes in. That's what's really important. Much more important than whether we eat or not, is how we relate to that. What's going on in our mind and our reaction when that's taking place. And then we have rules about money. Money basically symbolizes getting your desires fulfilled. There's nothing particularly wrong about pieces of paper and coins, but money symbolizes that ability to fulfill your desires. And so when we renounce money, then we're making a very clear statement. This lifestyle that we've chosen, it's not about just fulfilling our desires. That's not where happiness and freedom is going to be found, fulfilling our desires. And then if you study the Vinaya in all this way, there are many, many small rules that you have to know. For example, in Achaan Chah's day, a lot of the monastic requisites in the village monasteries would be bought with money from the monks themselves. They were given money, they would use the money then to buy the bowl, buy the robes, pretty much everything they had. But then once they entered the forest monasteries, any of those requisites which were bought using money, it was a dukkata, or minor offense, to use that requisite. In fact, it was a dukkata for any other monk to use that requisite as well. So in the end, you had some of these robes, shoulder bags, these various things that were bought with money that no one could use. So in the end, what they would do is just gather it all together and burn it. It was good. What you had to do? Just burn it and get rid of it. Vinaya encourages us to try to be content with what we have. Ajahn Chah would emphasize this a lot. In the early days of his monastery, there weren't a whole lot of requisites. Life was very simple. It was a very poor area where they were living. So they had to learn to be content. They didn't really have a choice. But then as the monastery grew, as it became more famous, as it became more well supported, there were a lot of requisites, but still that basic emphasis on just being content with simple things. You don't need to have fancy robes, new robes all the time. We're encouraged, if we have a robe, then try to make it last as long as possible. Wash it carefully, hang it up in the line just long enough as necessary. Fold it neatly, keep it clean, look after it properly. And when it starts to get thin, then patch it. Try to make it last as long as you can, to a reasonable extent, even when there's plenty of robes waiting in the storeroom. It's just an attitude of learning how to be content, which is a very simple but important key to happiness that is starting to disappear in our modern society. Just learning how to be content with what we have. Okay, it may not be great. It may not be the newest thing. It may not be flash. But it's good enough. It's good enough for practicing the Dhamma. It's good enough for what we need. And that sense of contentment is supported by a lot of the minor rules in the Vinaya. So a lot of these minor rules keep bringing us back to these basic qualities of mind: contentment, gratitude, being satisfied with just a little. Even when there's a lot, just being satisfied with just a little. One time Ajahn Chah was given a very prestigious title called a Chao Khunship. And this was a story that I just heard recently from Ajahn Sucitto. And he said that Ajahn Chah traveled to Bangkok, and these Chao Khun titles, or honorary recognitions, were given out by the king to special monastics who were recognized. And so when he got to Bangkok, and they were preparing to go into the king's palace, the city monks were all dressed in their very fancy robes. They usually had quite a few sets, and so they were dressed in their fancy robes and, all pressed and kind of tied up. And then Ajahn Chah arrives, and he's just got his very simple, country, rough robes, forest monk robes, dyed with a natural dye. And he looked like a real country bumpkin. And he had his bowl. He was carrying his bowl with him. And apparently some of the other monks said, "What'd you bring your bowl for? We're going into the palace, the king's palace. What's the king going to say, when you bring your bowl into the palace?" And Ajahn Chah said, "Well, what would the Buddha say if I didn't?" So for Ajahn Chah, for my understanding of the way Ajahn Chah used the Vinaya as a training tool, one of the main emphases was on using it to develop mindfulness, sati, this continuous awareness throughout the entire day. And so many of the minor rules, the protocols, the etiquette in the monastery are based on that, and they require a continuous mindfulness, because almost everything that we do, there's a proper way to do it. And it takes mindfulness, it takes awareness. And something as simple as washing our bowl, drying our bowl, that becomes the meditation object. So when Ajahn Chah was using the Vinaya as a teaching and training tool, he was talking about developing a mindfulness which was not just a mindfulness that was based on a very refined aspect of a meditation technique, or a mindfulness that was located just at the tip of your nose, but a mindfulness that was applicable in every situation, which would be aware of everything that's going on in a particular situation. You come into a particular situation, a group, you very carefully, very intuitively suss out, okay, well, this is what the situation is. And if people are very mindful like that, then naturally behavior, proper behavior follows. So a lot of the monastic etiquette that we have is based on developing this type of mindfulness, a continuous awareness, moment by moment. Because then when we do sit down to meditation, it's not like we've just been allowing our minds to wander. You know? We've been training in meditation, training in mindfulness, moment by moment. And then when we sit down to meditate, boom, we're right there. Close our eyes, and there's a seamless continuity of training throughout the day. Something as simple as bowing. Ajahn Chah would encourage us to bow every time we came into our hut, every time we left. And this practice then has been passed down. So when I was a young monk, Ajahn Chah was no longer teaching. He was still alive, but no longer teaching. So almost everything that I learned about his way of relating to the Vinaya came from his immediate disciples. And something as simple as bowing, becomes a real meditation practice. Because every time you come into your kuti, bow 3 times to the shrine, Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. If you don't have a shrine, then you bow to your bowl 3 times. And if you do that with even a little bit of sincerity, you say, I'm bowing. A bow is like lowering our head, lowering what is considered high, lowering our ego and placing it down in front of our higher ideals, things we respect, Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. And just doing that repeatedly, 3 times when you enter your hut. You go out to the toilet, bow 3 times. Come into the meditation hall, you bow 3 times. You sit down in your seat in the meditation hall, you bow 3 times. You get up, you bow 3 times. And each time that we do that, it's like just a little drop of wholesome karma. One more good intention. And then that begins to accumulate. They're very simple practices. These are not extremely complicated. But just the cumulative effect of bowing, bowing, bowing with a heart that is full of devotion for the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. It forms a very strong foundation then for meditation. And then Ajahn Chah would, he wouldn't just say bow anyways, he would have a very particular way to bow. So when you're bowed, you have to really be in your body. And so this kind of practice is very good for people who are a bit intellectual. You just get your awareness in your body, right? I think he had quite a bit of fun with the Westerners sometimes, and their strange ways of bowing. He said, no, get your butt down. Get your butt down. No, don't put your hands out here. Hands here. Yeah, that's right. Here, here. But because even something as simple as a bow, to do it properly, you have to develop mindfulness. You have to be mindful of what you're doing. So the way Ajahn Chah used the Vinaya as a training tool encompassed all these different aspects of the Vinaya. It was a convention that led one gradually away from worldly habits. A convention that gradually led to a sense of communal harmony. Because practically speaking, if we're living in a group, it's just so much easier if everyone's doing things in a particular way. If you live in communities, then it would be nice if everyone could live in absolute harmony without any rules. And in the early, very early part of the Buddha's teaching career, that's the way it was, because everyone was a fully enlightened arhat. But in those communities which everyone is not a fully enlightened arhat, then it can be very helpful to have the Vinaya as a training guide. And so Ajahn Chah never encouraged a blind following of the Vinaya, but using it as a tool to develop wisdom. It was very powerful, because if we're living in community and we have a certain framework that we're following, then inevitably it comes up. Our ego, our sense of self, our desires will come up against that. And that's precisely the place where we can practice. And say, well, I don't really feel like doing it right now. Doesn't matter. You do it anyways. You say, well, why do we have to do it this way? Why can't we do it that way? Well, it's true. It doesn't really matter if we do it this way or that way, but our community has agreed to do it this way, so we do it that way. And so all these views and opinions and attachments to views and opinions that can come up, just reflect back to us. Okay, am I suffering? Where's the suffering coming from? Is it really coming from some external situation? No, it's coming from my own mind. And so these very simple daily experiences, washing the spittoons, attending on the senior monks, very good for developing wholesome states of mind. There's a lot of respect for elders in the Vinaya. And again, this is a quality which is easily disappearing in our modern society. And respect for elders, it's not about whether the elder is enlightened or not. A lot of what we do in our communities is just based on who has ordained first. And then respect is paid according to that. And the junior ones serve the senior ones, and the senior ones then have responsibilities towards the junior ones, and it's a beautiful system. And it encourages this constant wholesome states of mind coming up. Say, well, how can I help? How can I help? If we're given the job of being an attendant for a senior monastic, then the junior one could be looking, well, how can I make life easier for the senior one? How can I do things which will assist them in some way? How can I make life a bit more comfortable for them? And this type of thinking just goes against the habit of selfishness. And again, it just creates good karma. There's just so many opportunities for developing good karma, for developing the paramis in these daily acts of monastic life. Recently we had a lot of senior monks visiting our monastery in New Zealand, and for me it was fantastic because I got to be a junior monk again, which I enjoy it better the second time around. But just having the opportunity to go to the senior monks and offering a foot massage, it's great, it's joyful. It's like, what a wonderful opportunity to increase a little physical pleasure or reduce a little physical suffering for the senior monk. If you've ever done a meditation retreat, then some of the monastic etiquette is very useful to develop a sense of consideration and kindness. Again, sometimes just following rules, you think, well, just blindly following rules, but if you understand the purpose behind them, very good for pointing us back to developing wholesome states of mind. For example, if you're in a meditation retreat, then developing a sense of bodily silence is a very considerate and compassionate way to relate to everyone around you, because we all affect each other. And especially in a meditation retreat where people are, they are developing a sense of silence. And so not only just keeping noble silence in speech, but also developing a physical silence. That takes a lot of mindfulness. You have to be mindful. You have to be aware of how your body's moving, getting up from your seat and doing it quietly, and sitting down, doing it quietly. If you have to sneeze or cough, then try to muffle it so it doesn't make much sound. All of these things then give rise to a sense of kindness and consideration, which then, again, accumulates and creates a harmony within a community. So the way that Ajahn Chah used the Vinaya then is beneficial as a mental training on many, many different levels, from the most, say, gross, as just stopping us from making bad karma, right down to very refined daily things. Because he said, really, once you're living the monastic life, it's not the major rules which lead you to enlightenment, it's the minor rules. Because you would never go out and kill someone, kill an animal, or steal, right? But these minor rules we're developing and working with all the time, forcing us, encouraging us to be very mindful, to give rise to wholesome states of mind. This discipline, and the purpose of discipline, leads to the sense of restraint. And the sense of restraint leads to the sense of freedom from remorse. And freedom from remorse is just a sense of feeling good about oneself. If you've lived a life which you haven't been intentionally trying to harm anyone else, you've done your best to live a life which is harmless, which is beneficial, which is wholesome, that naturally gives rise to a sense of freedom from remorse. I think it's like a wholesome sense of self-esteem. And that gives rise to joy, and leading on to tranquility, and that gives rise to a sense of rapture and happiness. And once you have happiness arising from this lifestyle, then when you sit down to meditation, the mind concentrates easily. And when the mind concentrates easily, then it gives rise to seeing things as they truly are, as a natural consequence. And then that leads on to the fading away. Fading away of passion, turning away from being enchanted with the world, which does then give rise to a sense of liberation. So from the very beginning stages right to the very end, Ajahn Chah would see the Vinaya as going hand in hand with the Dhamma. You can't really separate them. From washing the spittoons right to Nibbana, as they say in New Zealand, it's all good. So I offer this for your reflection today.